Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Crispin Blunt. I'm the MP for Reigate. I've been kicking around in Parliament now for 26 years, and during all of that time I've taken a keen interest in Middle Eastern affairs, and in particular have been privileged enough to work with, time to time, with Forward Thinking, who have been an absolutely marvellous organisation, both on the domestic and foreign affairs front, working in the interests of mediation and bringing communities of all different sorts together. It's a delight to see Oliver McTurnan here with us today, and it's typical of the convening power of Forward Thinking that they can bring together a meeting like this with such distinguished speakers at relatively short notice to address the declining situation as regards political rights and freedoms in Tunisia. And it's my privilege then to chair and enable today's meeting. And I know who we don't have here is obviously Julian Weinberg, who did much of the great work of Forward Thinking in enabling a route forward in a nation that started the whole process of the Arab Spring in order to bring political Islamists into the wider fold, to be able to be part of democracy in its proper sense, in representing the views of the people in a way that is not then a wider threat to the societies in which it finds itself. And that was a profound issue, and one that the Foreign Affairs Committee, when I chaired it, investigated in our inquiry into political Islam. And I'll wait for the bell announcing the start of business to finish. In many ways, the evidence we took from Rached Ghannouchi and his colleagues on the committee's visit to Tunisia in 2016 was they were in many ways the star pupils of how to make a proper accommodation between the forces of political Islam, which were misrepresented, cast as a revolutionary danger to their societies, and Enada and the leadership of Rached Ghannouchi, and the rebranding of political Islamists as Islamic Democrats was then symbolic of the wise accommodation and the reassurance needed from the different forces within the societies of the Middle East, then emerging, tragically not successfully now in most cases, out of the opportunity that should have been the Arab Spring. And perhaps it's the saddest of all that we need to have this meeting about Tunisia, given the apparent progress that was being made even only a few years ago, until the behaviour of the current president. And I'm delighted to say that we've got a very good cast of speakers here to discuss this. And I'm going to turn in turn to Dr. Anas Al-Tikriti, who has founded the Cordoba Foundation, again has been engaged in really good work about explaining to his own nation and Western societies generally about what is actually happening and what's actually represented by these movements engaged. We do, of course, have the daughter of Rached Ghannouchi here, and delighted to have Sumama with us, who will speak to us. We then got Rodney Dixon, King's Counsel, who for a long time has been one of the preeminent lawyers around the political rights, particularly engaged here, and has been the go-to legal counsel that people will use. And then, of course, we have the son of Saeed Fajani, another Tunisian parliamentarian with very strong British links, who is now detained, and we met a few weeks ago after Parliament was detained, and so to have kind of first-hand testimony in a few moments from the children of some of the leading figures in trying to deliver democracy and a proper advance into a representative future for Tunisia, and all the sacrifices your families have had to put up with because of the roles your fathers have taken will be touching and moving, and I'm much looking forward to what you have to say. But with that, it's quite enough from me. It's people who really know what is going on, and we'll start with Dr. Anna Salter-Priestley.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Crispin, and to Forward Thinking for putting this together. The first thing I'd like to mention, Crispin, that it's always been a pleasure observing your work, working with you, exchanging ideas with you, even disagreeing with you. It's actually been quite a pleasure, and I was quite sad to learn that you're standing down at the next elections. I think that your presence is extremely important and very, very significant. It is, and but there we go. That's the way things are.
I don't quite have Rached Ghannouchi's staying power.
Well, thank you very, very much. Now, what's happening today in Tunisia is of extreme significance, and not only for Tunis and Tunisians, of course, but also to us here in Britain. Today here we're going to hear about the stories of Sheikh Rached Ghannouchi, a resident of London, for a quarter of a century almost, 25 years I would suggest, and as well as Sayyid Ferjani, whose families, whose homes are here in the UK. And therefore, not only their interest, but also on a wider level, the interest to us as a democracy is at risk, I would suggest, and the reasons are these. What's happening in Tunisia is basically the killing off of the last remnants of the Arab Spring. And just so that we go back and remember exactly what the Arab Spring means. The Arab Spring was one of the most transformative moments of this current century. In fact, I would say in my own living memory. The fact that a people can rise peacefully and face despots and dictators of many generations and have them removed and their countries transformed onto the track of democracy is something that is almost unheard of. A bloodless revolution where people adopted a tactic and a strategy and a choice of peaceful means to remove their despots and dictators is something that is absolutely remarkable in today's world. And today that experiment, that phase is being killed off. Imagine the kind of impact on our young's minds when they see that that track does not work, when that track will ultimately end in what is happening in Tunis today. Sheikh Rached Ghannouchi and Sayyid Ferjani were true Democrats. I grew up reading the earlier opinions of Sheikh Rached Ghannouchi, which were at the time seen as controversial even within Islamist movements. They were far too liberal, far too westernized. He was talking about democracy, he was talking about human rights, he was talking about rights of women, about equality, about all these things at a time when I was a young lad of 15 and 16 years old. And they impacted me immensely. But I was impacted even more when I got to meet with him, sit with him, travel with him, translate and interpret with him, and see him in action. He was a true Democrat. He was happy to give away his rightly gained democratic gains in order to maintain stability, to maintain the integrity of the experiment of the Arab Spring in Tunisia. And if anything, you know, people talk today about what's happened in Egypt in 2013, and what's happened in Tunisia was delayed by almost 8 to 10 years simply because of the stands of the likes of Sheikh Rached Ghannouchi and the stands of Sayyid Ferjani. And that is something that, again, if we allow these Democrats to be treated in the way that they have been, thrown into prison, just imagine the impact on the young who we continuously preach democracy to, we continuously preach equality, the ballot boxes to, when they throw in our faces the experiments of Qais Said and how he treated Sheikh Rached Ghannouchi and Said Farjan. It's something which we ought to think about. Now, just to end, the coup hasn't promised what it said that it would. It hasn't delivered economic prosperity. It hasn't delivered on the issue and the crisis of unemployment. It hasn't delivered on security. Only last week there was this attack on a Tunisian synagogue. It hasn't delivered in terms of, we have now the prospect of rising figures of illegal migrants from the shores of Tunisia. Once again, just like Algeria, just like Morocco, trying to reach the southern shores of Europe. So the coup hasn't delivered as the world said that it would. And to be perfectly honest, it is tragic that we find that not only in Tunisia, but throughout the region that witnessed, saw, experienced and experimented the Arab Spring and that phase of democracy, of openness, where there were no political prisoners. Yet now we find tens of thousands once again lingering in the dungeons and prison cells of these despots. Unfortunately, we find that the liberals, or so-called liberals, in Tunisia, and their friends across the shores in Europe, that they would far sooner see a despot or a dictator in power than a free and fairly elected Islamist. And that is an indictment of us if we stand by and do absolutely nothing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. It's now going to be a particular pleasure to listen to Sumawa Ghannouchi, and having met your father in Tunisia on that occasion, I will just indulge myself by reprising I think what you might call the champagne moment of that meeting, which is when, to my astonishment, my colleague Adam Holloway, who was a member of Parliament and a member of that delegation, then intervened on our meeting with your father to reveal he had a past with him, and his past was as an ITV television correspondent, where he had staked out your family home in London with a view to establishing that he was in bed with all sorts of people, not in an absolute sense, in a political sense, with all sorts of apparent forces supporting unlawful violence in resistance to the state, otherwise described as terrorism, in order to have him banged to rights by having had your home under observation. And his intervention was to apologise, because what he established was that there was nothing of the kind going on, and he'd been sent on a fool's errand, and he took the opportunity then to say sorry across the table, and then having become rather more familiar with the reality of your father's astonishing contribution, took that opportunity to say sorry firsthand. It was quite a moment. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Crispin, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you, Anas, and thank you, Oliver. Thank you all for being here with us. Over the last 2 years, the world has watched Tunisia turn from a successful story of a successful democracy, though a fragile democracy beset with challenges and difficulties. They watched it turn into a full-fledged dictatorship, and a failed dictatorship in every respect. Qais Said, its populist president, climbed up to power using the democratic ladder, but once he was there, he kicked the ladder aside, a ladder created thanks to the revolution and thanks to the progressive constitution it generated. He kicked this democratic ladder aside, then set about destroying it completely. So how did he do that? As soon as Said, this populist dictator, set foot in the presidential palace, he sought to invest in crises and tensions in a country that is in transition, in a state of transition. He invested in the economic crisis and the health crisis generated by the epidemic in order to execute his coup on the 25th of July, as you know, 2021. He blockaded Parliament with a military vehicle and started to run the country through presidential decrees. So he, unlike Sisi, he did not execute his coup at once, in one go. He did so in doses. He devoured Tunisia's democracy bit by bit, dismantled its institutions one by one, in order to make way for his own political system, based on his own dangerous populist vision, a one-man system where neither political parties nor any form of bodies, organized bodies, have a place. So the constitution, the consensual constitution, Tunisians painstakingly achieved after much discussion and free dialogue over 3 years, was scrapped in favor of one he himself wrote, granting himself absolute authority, placing all powers in his hands, executive, legislative, and judicial. He sought to impose his coup by seizing control of two things, the security services and the judiciary, using them as tools of coercion and political revenge.
Take a quiet second. Sorry.
So he dissolved the independent Supreme Judicial Council, appointing his own again, and set about harassing judges and bringing them to their knees. And this was the introduction to the crackdown we see today underway. Anyone who opposed him was to be thrown in jail using these tools, the judges who have been harassed and brought to their knees, and the security services. Not only politicians, journalists, trade unionists, civil society activists, even ordinary citizens who would write a simple post on Facebook criticizing their situation. Everyone was to be persecuted if they dared say no. As you know, you spoke of my father. My father, the country, the elected parliament speaker, the leader of the largest party in the country, was seized from our home on the 27th night of Ramadan, a night, as you well know, you know the region, a night of particular significance and symbolism, a night of celebration and joy. He was seized from our home as the family prepared to break its fast just before sunset. Around 100 security officers besieged the home, raided the home, searched every room, looking for any evidence that might incriminate him and justify his detention. He was taken to a military barrack. He spent the night seated on my 81-year-old father, seated on a chair, while they concocted this ludicrous charge of conspiring against state security, conspiring to change the nature of the state. And I don't know who is guilty of changing the nature of the state, someone who inherited a democratic system and turned it into a one-man rule, or Rached Ghannouchi, who was, you know, the man at the forefront of the creation of this democratic system. Tunisia today is a cocktail of festering crises: political, social, financial, economic. It's a deadly cocktail which risks exploding at any moment. Why? Because the man in charge is not interested in diffusing tensions or resolving any of the real, rather than imaginary, problems the country faces. His sole concern is amassing power and persecuting critics. And he doesn't see them as critics, he sees them as enemies. And this list of enemies grows by the day, if not by the hour. From political dissidents from every background. We talked about liberals, but we have many liberal dissidents in jail, all opposed to the coup. From dissidents, political dissidents, to vulnerable African migrants. From foreign powers to their imaginary agents. Everyone is conspiring against him. Everyone is evil. He is the incarnation of virtue, the embodiment of virtue, of the state, of the nation, of sovereignty. He feeds he feeds the nation daily a rhetoric of hatred. Invest in crises in order to distract the nation. And that's the difference between having a normal dictator and having a populist dictator. A populist dictator is far more dangerous. He seeks to turn everyone against people in society, against each other. He invests in civil strife. And the recent elections, which were boycotted by around 90% of Tunisians, if official statistics are to be believed, have exposed his eroding legitimacy. So what we have in Tunisia is a populist dictator without much popularity anymore, a populist dictator unable to provide Tunisians with their most basic needs. People have to queue up to get some sugar, some oil. Even the most basic needs have been denied. So this man hasn't just robbed Tunisians of their freedoms, he even robbed them of their most basic needs. The only hope for Tunisians today is to cross over to the other side of the Mediterranean, throw themselves in death boats and seek escape at any price. And I think Europe is mistaken if it believes that a tyrant who robs his people of their freedoms, of any sense of hope, who feeds them a daily staple of fear, hatred and despair, can provide it with this, can guard its shores and keep the death boats away, because this is the excuse Europe, and at the forefront of which the right-wing, the far-right government is in Italy, is justifying support for this tyrant, is that he can keep the migrants away. But you can't do so. You can't rely on a tyrant, on a populist dictator to provide stability. Only through accountable governments, only through democracy can you guarantee stability, can you provide hope for citizens, and can you keep the death boats away, the migrant boats away. So Tunisians are not asking anyone to do their job for them, to resist this dictatorship for them. They have ample experience in resisting dictatorships through the years. What they're asking is for Europe to call things by their proper names, to call a coup against democracy, to call it a coup, to call a populist, ugly dictatorship a dictatorship. The least it should do, morally and politically, is not reward a tyrant who has robbed his people of their freedoms, of their hard-won democracy, reward them financially or politically. Call a coup, and request that any form of support be conditional on respect for human rights, on release of political prisoners, on a national inclusive dialogue around how we can restore the institutions of democracy. That is the least Europe can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's an utterly reasonable and rather powerful list of requests of Tunisia's European neighbours, and completely consistent with our own professed values. And I suppose the only little ironic observation I will make, and I make this as a former chair of the humanist group in Parliament, so my engagement with the political Islamic movements has been one of discovery of some kinds, and an absence of faith on my part, that in dealing with the great example of Inada and accommodations it has made with some of the more fundamentalist tenets that might have arrived in politics within as part of its development, to now find itself under the cosh of a president who is apparently instructed by the Almighty as the only basis, as far as I can see, of the actions he is taking, that he feels he has a direct line that is not possessed by certainly me or the rest of us, is an irony that I think people might quite like to reflect on. On that note, I would now like to turn to the son of Saïd Fajani, who is also under the cosh of the president of Tunisia, Seyfeddine.
So, thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you, Forward Thinking, for inviting us to talk about what's going on in Tunisia. The relationship between my father and Forward Thinking has been long-standing. My father's been active in these areas, whether in here on grassroots activism, or overseas about kind of like talking about what's going on in Tunisia, what's going on in the world, regarding prisoners of conscience in Tunisia, regarding the repression of President Ben Ali against his opponents, all of them. But today I'm here as his son, so I'm just going to give you a bit of background about my father. So the first memory I have of my father that is very, very striking is when I was 7 years old, and I wake up to policemen with guns inside our home. My father kind of like, I wake up, I'm a bit startled, and then I see that my father is, they're searching my room, they're searching my bedroom. My brother is asleep, and I just see a barrel of a gun facing me. Later, I just see my father in handcuffs, in his pajamas, and he asks permission to kiss me, which I later find out that he thought it would be the last time that he will see me. Then my mother leaves, running after them, just to find out where they're going to put him. So that's my earliest memory, that kind of like I still go back to, and it's my driving force and that I don't want any other Tunisian to go through that process of waking up suddenly and then seeing a bunch of people with guns in front of your face. Unfortunately, we may be heading back in a more permanent way to that time. After that, as a child, I used to help my mother, just with the household chores, because I was the man of the house, and I would, find specks of blood everywhere on his trousers, on his shoes, on his, and I would ask my mom, what is this? I said, oh, you must have found some meat, and you must have, cut them up, and that's what I believed. Actually, I'm 7 years old, so I'm quite naive. I'm still quite naive in many ways, but that's how it went. Later, of course, I understand that my father was subject to horrific torture, 72 hours non-stop at one point. And for the first 6 months at least within the actual Tunisian jail from 87, torture did not stop. Even when he came here to the UK, contrary to many kind of like people who would have Ben Ali regime would have said, his body was an actual piece of evidence on the horrific nature of the repressive regime of Ben Ali. His back, he could hardly walk. My father, when he was quite a fit man, and then suddenly, when he came from prison, he was hardly walking, and even here, he still has problems with walking sometimes. But throughout the process of him being here, I remember when we first lived in North Acton, and we had a small TV. There was the elections occurred in 1990, I think, I believe, if memory serves me, but it might not. That at the end of, he was following the elections, and then at the end of it, the image that he kind of like was fascinated by was the opposition leader and the leader of the government joking.
Having 97. 1st of May 1997. Change of powers on the 2nd of May.
So even that, and the election of the leader of the Conservative Party after Thatcher had resigned, the way it went, it was fascinating to him that you can actually oppose, you can actually kind of interact in that way. That was democracy in action. It was many people coming together with opposing views for the single benefit of this country. And that was it. And that's what he believed in, and that's what he kind of pushed him forward. So when you see all the interviews that he went on later in the US and everywhere else, which he talked about citizenship as a main currency of governance, he stuck to it. And I think many here who know him personally would remember that, and he's been very consistent on that throughout. We fast forward now to the revolution. After many years of working grassroots activity, grappling with all the different issues that happened here in the UK, he was there, and he made it. He was there he saw it his duty to put his hand to the other side. Not only him, of course, because I'm only talking about my personal experience, my interaction with my father, what I witnessed myself. But I found it extremely difficult that my father could easily forgive the injuries that I had when I was a child. And when we pushed him on that, he said, there is a choice you have to make. A Tunisia that is better, or we act the same as Ben Ali. There is no other path. And he put his hand forward. This is not to say that my father is some grand hero, or he had different morals or characters. We all have our flaws. But to say that he made a conscious choice, a painful choice, that he chose a future for Tunisia that is better than it was. Later, when he worked for the Justice Ministry, he was given responsibility for the prisons service, and he saw the complexity of the problem that you had after many years and decades of oligarchies and corrupt institutions that can't be simply erased by a click or by a magic bullet. It needed a process, and democracy was the best process. And that's why he was enthused and moved forward to become an MP in 1997. Sorry, 2019. And the issue was, and still is, if you believe in democracy, you must believe that you cannot upend it. If you believe in democracy, you must be able to accept others who differ from you. You cannot believe that you have the monopoly of truth within that context, because all of us are fallible. Truth may migrate from one individual to another. Whether you want to quote Edmund Burke or Shafi'i, both have the same quote, which is, I am right until it's proven otherwise, and you are wrong until it's proven otherwise, but both of our views are legitimate. And that's the guiding principle that he had, and any who have worked with him would know this. This is why when I spoke to him days before he was detained, on the 27th of February, I said, did we do anything wrong? He said, I'm okay. I've done the maximum that I can. I've followed this route through, and I still believe tomorrow is going to be better. Even after you're arrested? Yes, even after you're arrested. He had no regrets, and he still has no regrets. So the issue here for us today, Nahda, which is my father's party, to him represented a way forward for Tunisia and a vision in a letter he did right after he won his election for Qayrawan, being representative of Qayrawan. We sat down and we wrote something about the West and Tunisia. We are part of the West and the West is part of us. It is not to say that being Democrats means that you basically sell your integrity or your culture or your beliefs, but democracy is based on the current. One, it's based on the acceptance of the other. It is based on the feeling that you will have to cede power. And in every single way of that, that has happened with another party. And with people like my father, with people like Sheikh Ghannouchi or Mr. Ghannouchi, who is, as people will know, he was a student of, my father was a student of Sheikh Rached in Qayrawan. And moving quickly forward to close this, Nahda has ceded power continuously, did not monopolize it. And obviously, it's a Muslim democratic force in Tunisia. Here and everywhere else, the lesson from Tunisia should be that it does not matter why people refuse to accept democracy as the way to mediate power. What matters is that we have to stand up for the rights of others. We have to never regret moving forward for democracy. And we have to uphold not only our rights due to our interests, but everybody else's, so that we can live in a collective community that respects and upholds the rule of law through respecting citizenship rights. And this is my view of it, and this is my father's view. Sorry if I took too long.
No, thank you very much. Very, very powerful statements as well. We've got one more main speaker, and then I'm going to leave the room at 10:15, regardless of if you're still going, because I have a live radio interview to do, and I've got to get the Zoom link up by 10:20. So I'm then going to ask Jordan Morgan, before thinking, to stand in for me as chair and to then preside over the discussion. We will have to leave the room promptly at 10:30, which is a kind of absolute rule of room bookings in the House of Commons. So if I give you those writing instructions as chair, and so we invite people in the discussion to be brief and as crisp as they can, so to give as many people as a go as possible. But before that, let's listen to one of the finest legal authorities on the whole human rights area, particularly on international law, Rodney Dixon.
Thank you very much, Crispin, and I will be to the point, so hopefully I'll be done by the time you are stepping out. It's a real privilege to be instructed by the families of those who are detained, including Mr. Ghannouchi and Mr. Fajani, and a number of others as well, in order to seek whatever legal remedies they are for this appalling situation. I mean, you've heard today the very moving, both personal but also forensic evidence as to why legal action is entirely justified. Of course, that's only part of the solution. There are various political actions that are needed, and I'm sure you're going to discuss those. I'm going to focus on what legal steps can be taken based on the very clear evidence of mass and systemic violations that are going on now, that have got a deep history, and are only looking, by all accounts, to get worse and worse and worse, unless steps are taken immediately. We have, in that regard, applied to the Foreign Secretary here, the Foreign Office here. We did that on the 22nd of March, urging that sanctions be imposed on those responsible at the highest level for these violations. I should stress that that's not asking the British government to impose sanctions on the country, on the people, not looking to make the economic situation even worse. What we are relying upon is the global human rights sanctions regime, which came into force in this country in 2020, which permits the government to focus on individuals and only them who are responsible for human rights violations. Where there's sufficient evidence of that, and we say clearly there is, then the government can impose sanctions on them, identify them in their individual capacity, and prevent them from travelling here, freeze their assets, not only of them but of those associated with them as well, stop them doing business in the country, and continuing as though everything is going on as normal. We've done the same in the EU as well, the same has happened in the US. So it's not just one country, it's trying to stop them continuing with the operations around the world, and to identify the assets, to freeze them, to stop them travelling. And the people we focused on are clearly the current president, Kais Saied, but also others in his government, including the current Interior Minister, Kamel Feki, the current Justice Minister, Leila Jafal, the Minister of National Defence, very important, Emad Mehmet, and previous ministers who have been overseeing the violations that are taking place. We have identified them as those most responsible. Of course, there's a network below them, but they're the ones who are overseeing what we are hearing about today. They are directing it, allowing it to happen, and perpetuating it. And that is why it's entirely appropriate, we say, based on this legislation we have in this country, to impose sanctions upon them individually. We have had acknowledgement of our application, it's been considered, but we would urge all MPs and everyone more broadly to stress to the government that this is an immediate priority. They should look to consider this matter and act quickly. The whole point of this regime was to provide a lightning strike. You don't have to go through an endless court process or apply to some court somewhere. You can consider it, and providing there's a sufficient basis, you can immediately impose the sanctions. And of course, if the situation changes, you can lift the sanctions. So it's there as a stick to signal that there are violations going on, not for something to be kicked down the road to happen in 6 months' time or a year's time, but to happen immediately. This has happened in many other situations. As you can imagine, it's happened recently in relation to Ukraine, China, and I'm not saying it shouldn't happen in relation to those situations, but it should apply equally to all countries where there are mass human rights violations. It shouldn't be a competition, but it's important that the government looks more broadly than its immediate priorities that are in the media all the time to other situations that clearly demand its attention. So it's a very useful legal tool that can be deployed instantaneously. It'll send a strong message of condemnation, but also hopefully deterrence, that unless this stops, more is going to come. And we do in that regard plan to add other persons to our application as well. You are entitled to do that, so can the government do that. In particular, we are focusing on judges who are currently being used by the government to do its dirty work and impose verdicts like the one that happened recently in absentia, without any fair trial or due process, to impose those verdicts on persons who are in detention or other judgments that are clamping down on the most basic freedoms. So we can add such persons, we will do so based on the evidence. They will be identified, and those judges who haven't toed the line have themselves been victimized. And that's evidence that we will add into this as well. So we're going to continue identifying persons and pressing the government to take that action here and abroad as well. And that's what we'd urge all MPs and others to be doing at the moment, to bring that to the government's attention.
I want to thank you very much indeed for that. I'm going to ask you after the meetings and to engage with my assistant Freddie Bose in order to just establish a link of communication about exactly what you're up to in the legal space, so that we can be across it here politically as well, and then try to act together to assist your efforts in bearing fruit. But thank you everyone for coming today. I'm now going to hand over to Jordan Walker.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Crispin. And just to introduce myself, well, I'll move over, shall I? It's probably the easiest way. Then I can see everyone. So we've got literally 15 minutes left. My name is Jordan Morgan. I'm the Director of Programmes at Forward Thinking, and just wanted to say thank you to Anas and also Abdullah Falik, who couldn't be here today, for helping us organise the session, and thank you to our speakers as well for that heart-moving and emotional account of what's happened to your parents. So Forward Thinking has been involved in the work in Tunisia since the Arab Spring. For a number of years we've been deeply committed to dialogue and facilitating conversations since the Arab Spring and to bring parties together. I first went there in 2016 and looked at some of our work and engaged, and so it's desperately sad to see some of that, the opportunities for those sort of initiatives have now closed down. I remember fondly young Tunisians full of hope and ambition for the democratic process, pinning their senior politicians to the wall and asking for their rights and to be heard. And it's deeply saddening to hear that those opportunities have now gone. So we've got a few minutes left. If you could, I'm going to open the floor to questions. If you could just introduce yourself for us and keep your remarks very short. I'll take maybe five questions, and I'll start on this side of the room and then work around. So the floor is open. Yes.
So I'm the same from previous news. I asked Rodney, what has been the government's response? Have they agreed to sanction officials within Qaisaid's government? And also generally, if I can ask anyone on the panel, are you happy with the British response? And what is your communication, what has been your communication with the British government? And are you satisfied? Mainly Somalia, if you can comment on that, regarding the British response to the West.
Yeah. We'll take a couple at a time.
We have someone who's elderly, that's the concern.
Right.
It's okay.
Rodney, did you want to take the legal question, and then Samir will come to you?
Sure.
And yes. Do you want to go and grab a guard or just ask him to come? We're just going to get a guard for you, so. Cecily, have you got any water for him?
Yeah, there's been
Cecily, are any of these windows open? Perhaps we can crack a window.
I doubt it very much. Just need a little bit of ventilation.
Yeah. If the gentleman's okay, we'll proceed. And we've got someone coming to assist. So when they come, we'll just pause for the Rodney.
Yes, briefly, the government has not imposed sanctions yet. That's what we're pushing for at the moment. And we are looking to do that in a consistent way and add other names, as I've mentioned. But it's in their court now to consider this. They've got all the information and decide, and that's where we need to apply maximum pressure to get that considered and imposed. As they've done swiftly in other situations, they could do exactly the same here. So that's absolutely critical now that step is taken, because as I emphasised, it's one that can be launched very quickly. It doesn't require an elaborate, long process. Of course, if they don't do things, then there are actions we can take, and we can challenge that in court, but we don't want to go down that route. We don't want to make this adversarial. We should work together, all together, to combine and impose these sanctions, take that step as a minimum as soon as possible.
Great. Hello, thank you for your question. With regards to the British government's response, it's not much different from Europe's response in general. It's been rather timid. it's really statements of concern. And in fact, Qais Said himself mocks these statements of concern. He says, I'm actually concerned about your statements of concern. And as we said, Qais Said executed his coup in doses. He waited 2 years in order to barricade Parliament, and then 2 years in order to start his crackdown. And unless Europe realizes the danger, and the outside world realizes the danger of really these timid responses and the way it's emboldening this dictator, he will go further in the dismantlement of the state. We're not just talking about dismantling the democratic system, it's really dismantling the state altogether and building this one-man rule. What we have in Tunisia is another Gaddafi, but a very impoverished Gaddafi without much oil or petrol. And that is why we talked about the elections. It exposed the fact that his legitimacy is being eroded. He's relying on coercion in order to impose his rule, and that is why we need to exert pressure on him. Any form of support will be a lifeline for him because he is isolated. He is relying on coercion and persecution because he is isolated. Any form of support needs to be, as I said, conditional on releasing the prisoners and on respect for human rights.
What, if I may, Julie, what concerns me the most is the fact that there seems to be some sense of oblivion to the fact that what happens in Tunisia has a direct, not even an indirect, a direct impact on many of the issues that are seen to be pertinent by successive British governments. The issue of illegal migration, why do you think that happens? It happens because instability happens in countries like Tunisia, where people are driven to the periphery, where people are driven to actually get onto those death boats in order to try to reach safer shores in southern Europe, and hence arrive here in the UK. The fact that we do not see the direct impact of the disbelief or disconnection with democracy in the Middle East, in North Africa, is deeply troubling. So I'm not entirely sure whether there's a sort of naivety that governs the positions of power, or whether it's deliberate in some sense, but to ends that are beyond me. It's deeply troubling, and therefore the messages that were sent today, to be perfectly honest, whilst yes, of course, concerning Tunisia and Tunisian people, but they must be heard by Westminster. They must be heard by the British government and the relevant departments and ministries.
British people through the media as well.
So,
and British people,
of course,
through the media as well.
Yes. Yes.
So, from my perspective, there's an issue here of clarity. People in Britain, they have a very difficult, time of understanding what's going on in Tunisia, because Tunisia is usually beaches and everything else. But there is a problem with the fact that Qais Said promoted a deeply racist campaign against black people. There is an issue of deeply worrying signs about the change in the way that Tunisia operates now, using anti-terror squads in order to arrest liberal dissidents, socialist dissidents, trade unionists, as you said, and there is no concern whatsoever. There's been absolutely nothing being said publicly. There's a concern also that, whether we like it or not, Qais Said, when the Jerba attacks occurred, he refused to condemn them as a terror attack. Still does. He has never said they are a terror attack until now. And today, when he kind of started kind of dealing with the people who are the head of the Jewish community, he lectured the rabbi about how Tunisia is has a history of tolerance. And that's it. So, I think that Tunisia is a ticking time bomb. I think that the danger is underrepresented because, unfortunately, the headlines have been an earthquake. There's been issues happening everywhere with Sudan, with everywhere else. It's been crowding out the news about Tunisia, when Tunisia is an easy ask for the British government to stand up for government, stand up for peace, stand up for governance in Tunisia. And it's an extremely easy ask for the British government to stand up for Tunisia and its democracy and its people.
We've got one question here, and then Oliver, and then we'll come to you. So if we've got literally 4 minutes, so short, please.
Yeah, thank you. 4 minutes. The declining economy of Tunisia is in a very small number of hands. It's heavily concentrated ownership, and this clearly played a big part in the reason why the initiation of the Arab Spring didn't end up with success. What role is this playing now? As, for example, with their investments across the companies that have investments across Europe, what scope is there in this concentrated ownership to deal a blow to this dictatorship?
Oliver, and then...
Maybe I just want to make a comment at the end. Or,
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to raise the point of the United Arab Emirates, which has been very much engaged in the deconstruction of Tunisian democracy, as it has been engaged in various other efforts. We know about Sudan, we know about Libya. So I think that's a point, because the UAE and the UK have very close relations in terms of trade, but also our pursuit of a free trade deal. So I just wanted to raise that point.
Did you want to come in on the...
With regard to the economy, I mean, Tunisia, Qais Said inherited problems, economic problems, but he turned a difficult situation into a catastrophe. Tunisians now, as I said, they have to queue up even to get their most basic needs. We have a flight of investors, and the man uses the slogans of corruption, fighting corruption, in order to, as part of his populist discourse. But the first thing he did was dismiss the committee, the Anti-Corruption Independent Committee. And so within dictatorship, problems like corruption and economic failure flourish. So in Tunisia, what we have effectively is a failed dictatorship. People's dream is to leave, to board a boat, leave at any price. You can't have economic prosperity. That is the lie Qais Said sold Tunisians. Democracy is the problem. If you get democracy, you get economic prosperity. And now people ended up without democracy and with an economic catastrophe.
Thank you. And I'm going to give the final comment to our director, Oliver McTallan. But before I do, I just wanted to say thank you to Crispin for hosting us. Thank you to the Cordoba Foundation, to Abdullah and Anas again for bringing together such a wonderful panel of speakers. Thank you to Cecily and Alice as well for all your help organising. And thank you to you as participants to come and show your support and to listen to the perspectives. Now, I'll close with Oliver.
Jordan, thanks. And just to endorse your thanks to everyone for being here, particularly Crispin. Today took me back 15 years ago when, again, Crispin hosted a meeting in this house, and it was in the old buildings over in Parliament. It was for Abu Futu and Sheikh Rached.
Yeah.
And we talked about hope and where change, not a dream of the Arab Spring then, but where change would take us and the principles of those change. But it's with great sadness one recalls that today, because you think the people that are there, the main speakers, are in prison now. So all I wanted to say, we are still committed. We're very fortunate to have Crispin. Of all the people in Parliament, I would say Crispin Blunt is a man who always puts principle before his own interests. And that's a remarkable witness. And he's been committed and stood by us all along, and I'm sure Crispin will continue his interest in this. All I'm just saying is we are here. We will use whatever network or whatever we can to ensure this dialogue continues. And thank you for initiating it.
Well done. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you very much.